When push comes to shove, we say yes. But rather governments have a smaller mandate than an artificial mandate. That's why we do not stand for compulsory voting. I have 3 points of contention. Firstly, which side better fosters the democratic role which citizens need to play? Secondly, which side combats ignorance and apathy and develops democratic awareness? And last of all, which side better takes care of minorities? So on to the first question. Which side lets citizens take a democratic role? They told us of many groups of people with deep concerns and how they needed to express this to the government. That is not a rebuttal against our policy, because in our policy, if there is a deep concern and you do feel that the government can tackle it, then you can vote. So all the workers you're talking about who are disadvantaged with low wages are going to be voting in our policy. The debate does not hinge around people who already do vote in both of our cases. What does this debate then hinge around? It focuses around people who have deep grievances with the actual structure and the institution of the country. No thank you, all of you. And we told you that it's not fair to grace your government with a blank vote, because the very fact that you give a blank vote legitimizes the entire system of the government which carried out the election in the very first place. So if, for instance, you think there's an issue, but that neither party can solve it because they're just both too corrupt and it's embedded within all levels of the government hierarchy, we say there are many other democratic institutions you can turn to. Because the vote is just one out of many measures in democracies which allow people to express their voice. In fact, we think the vote is a relatively crude form, of you expressing your vote. Because it only lets you do so in an all or nothing manner. You either support everything this guy stands for, or nothing that this guy stands for. We think many other institutions allow you to express that in a much more fair and nuanced and clear manner, as when you carry out a protest. They said that protests don't work because they only happen when you disagree with something the government does. Firstly, that's a fully democratic expression of your voice. Secondly, no, sometimes when you agree with what the government does, but you disagree with it in some other areas, you can have a protest which specifically targets that particular area, unlike the vote. So we think there are many valid and viable alternatives to the vote which many people can use. So we don't see why they fetishize the vote above everything else. But we also pointed out to you that the blank vote itself whitewashes the opinions of people who have deep grievances against the structure of government. Now this is a very big point that Ben brought up. He gave you the illustration of what can happen in Scotland and Ireland, where people do not want to vote for any party or even express their support for the electoral system because the people they vote for will sit in Parliament in England, which they may disapprove of. We tell you, in that case, not even a blank vote is going to be sufficient to capture those sorts of views. Again, important analysis you never came back to touch. Then they said we need to legitimize politicians to force them to cater to the needs of people. But that happens in our policy as well. If your party isn't gaining enough votes, who will you appeal to? You appeal to the sort of people who didn't vote for you or didn't vote at all in the very first place. So on both sides of the house, politicians have an obligation and every incentive to appeal to voters in the first place. We don't think that particular point stood. On to therefore the next point about combating ignorance and apathy. We first told you that education and many of the other means to which we inform people of their rights happen under our policy as well. But then you wanted to talk about cases where, let's say, women are unaware of their votes and need to be compelled to exercise these. We say, firstly, that the vote should not be used as some sort of social experiment, as a means to an end. We think that's extremely dangerous, and I'll tell you why this is very dangerous in my point substantive. But we tell you furthermore, if people have not expressed democratic rights, I'll take you in a moment, we tell you should give them the time to come to be familiar with these and express them at their own will. If a person feels, I don't understand it yet, why are you telling him, we don't care, go to the vote, go to election and vote right now? Let people make that choice. Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, if the government is so corrupted and you need a new government, regardless of the petition or protest that's going to happen, at the end of the day you need another election.
Yes, where you will vote for 1 of 5 politicians, all of which are equally corrupt. So you're not going to make a difference that way. There are many other institutions where you can and should make this difference. So we tell you our policy fully combats ignorance and apathy, and they haven't shown us any advantage in that area. So we think we take that as well. Let me move on now to my last point about minorities. But this very nicely dovetails into my point of substantive about why their policy damages the institutions of democracy and empowers extremist parties, no thank you, by causing people to use the vote as a means of expressing their emotion instead of using it in a considered and a reasonable manner. Let's first look at the mindset of the voter. Before I move on, I'd like to first point out that Ben's point about why the vote is a right, and the right should be exercised with freedom, has also gone untouched. No thank you, because this will be important in the substantive. We think that there are many individuals who dislike the specific democratic institutions of the state, or who are disillusioned with all the parties. It's very important to these people that they have a right to use the vote as they see fit. We think distorting this vote by forcing them to vote for parties they may not support, or to cast a blank vote and support an institution they disagree with, is incredibly insulting and infuriating to many of these people because they see it as a violation, no thank you, of their right. We think creating a body of potential voters who are angry and frustrated is extremely dangerous, because there's a very high propensity for them to use the vote, not as a means of demonstrating what they really care for, but to use it as a means of expressing their anger and frustration. And they often do so by voting for extremist parties, parties that lie beyond the normal sphere of political discussions, which stands for incredibly dangerous and divisive policies. I'll take you in a moment, man. Why is this so? It's because psychological studies have shown that when people are compelled to do something, they tend to reject it. Yes?
So, if you think that voting is not important, then why does voting exist in the first place?
Voting exists because many people who do think that it is important, who have no grievances with either the parties or the system, can use that as one of the means available. We have other institutions to cater to other people with different needs. Let me move back now to my point of substantive. We think that this is very dangerous because people tend to reject options that they are compelled to do, even if these may be reasonable in and of themselves. In the 1990s, the American Psychological Association carried out a series of experiments in which test subjects were told in one circumstance to help researchers out with a certain set of actions. In another circumstance, they were compelled to do so, or they were told they would not get the compensation they were promised. Now, unsurprisingly, the second group perform their duties a lot worse. We think that exact same sort of logic applies to this situation. You turn people against the institution of the vote. But why don't they vote for these extremist parties? Because these parties run on the rhetoric that if you dislike the system, if you want to say no to the government and what it stands for, vote for us. This is incredibly dangerous because these parties stand for exactly the sort of policies that discriminate against minorities so often. We point to the fact that the National Party in Australia, for instance, gains most of its votes from people who do not know what its policies are, but who vote for it simply as an act of rebellion against the fact that in Australia, people are compelled to vote. In Malaysia, when we forced people to go to elections in 1969, the number of votes for the Kesatuan Melayu Muda, an extremist party, similarly increased massively. All of this is very dangerous. But in another way, the policy also disadvantages minorities. Because minorities often feel very passionately about the political system. They are not the apathetic ones. They almost always vote about issues. But what they're doing, they're empowering a silent, apathetic majority to vote. You now drown out the voices of the majority because the apathy of the majority, by sheer weight of numbers, prevents the minority's views and the intensity of their views from being expressed. What have I shown you, therefore? They harm minorities, they harm democratic institutions, and they harm our most basic rights. We stand proudly in opposition.